Well, once it was pretty obvious there was going to be a constitutional convention, as I understand it, unfortunately, you had to leave for your missionary work.
Yes, from 1961 to 1963, the summer of 61 to 63, I was in England. So I sort of kept in touch with what was going on at home, but not entirely.
Yeah, and unfortunately, at least in terms of our political history, you missed the whole the Constitutional Convention, because you were across the pond. And then your father decides at the end of 1961, while the convention was still going on, that he wanted to run for governor. And he ran against the incumbent governor, John Swainson, and he won. You missed that too.
I missed all that, but I know
you picked a terrible time to go.
No, it was a great time to go. But at any rate, because I saw a lot of other things subsequently. But yes, and when they had the con, he ran to be the head of it. I forget what they called the head. Yeah. He didn't make it. He was the vice chair, and that actually was a benefit to him, because then he was able to be more free to run for governor. He felt that he needed to run for governor to be able to encourage people to vote for this new Constitution. And he really ran for governor to be able to make a major effort. That was his major primary motive at the time.
Well, it's
to adopt this new Constitution.
Yeah, well, he won the election in November of '62, and then he campaigned tirelessly for 4 months, and in March of '63, so this is only 4 months later, 2 months after he took office, it passes. It was very close, and probably it wouldn't have passed if your father hadn't campaigned for it the way he did.
He worked tirelessly for that. But he really believed in it.
Well, then maybe everything was an anticlimax after that.
No, he enjoyed the other things that they were able to accomplish. That Constitution, though, created the first Civil Rights Commission in the United States, right. And Damon Keith and yes. John Fikens were the commissioners of the two heads of that, right. And that was a major effort that he was involved in, and he was very proud of that. And of course, it did many other things to reform the government of the state of Michigan.
Well, we'll get into that, but let me just ask you: do you think that one of the reasons he was such an apostle of the Civil Rights Commission and putting it in the Constitution, and open housing, which was another big issue later on in his turn as governor, was because maybe he was a little sensitive about the Mormon Church and the fact that they did not allow African Americans in the priesthood? Do you think your father felt, I got to show people I have a totally different attitude and I'm not bound by the tenets of the Mormon Church? My attitude toward African Americans is very different.
I don't think that made him overly sensitive. He believed that our church was fair and equal to everybody, and he didn't believe that that was a discriminatory practice. Obviously, he was delighted when it was changed in 1978 and really pleased about that. But I don't think that affected what really affected his view in civil rights was when he came back to Michigan and worked with so many African Americans in business and in charity and in other areas. And if you go back to the library at the University of Michigan, you'll see the letters he wrote to his own father about how he felt so strongly about equal rights for everyone, and that it was something that he really firmly believed in, largely because of his association with people that were here in Michigan. And so he just believed it was the right thing to do.
Okay. Now you come back finally from your missionary work in Great Britain, and it's like the summer of '63, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And you decided to transfer to Michigan State.
I didn't actually. I went back to Stanford for one more year. I went back to Stanford for a year and was there 63, 64. And then the 64 convention of the Republican Party was held in California at the Cow Palace. And so I was there at that convention when Goldwater was nominated.
So you hadn't gone to Michigan State at that point
I had
yet.
not. I went the next 2 years after that.
Okay. But while you were at Stanford, the family had to move to East Lansing. I think your family, your father bought a house or rented one in East Lansing, didn't he? Your sisters were there. Mitt would have been there. Maybe he was going to Cranbrook by this time?
Yes, they rented a home first, then they bought it. My sisters were pretty much out of school by that time and were married in college or then shortly after married. And Mitt spent his final 2 years at Cranbrook as a boarder at Cranbrook. So he actually didn't live in that house.
He didn't there either.
And they kept their home in Bloomfield Hills, so my parents would come home every weekend and be at that home, and then on the weekdays they'd be at their home in Lansing.
Well, now, speaking of your home, your mother and father had a famous marriage. Your father was famous for, supposedly, I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, placing a rose on her pillow every morning of their married life. Is that really true?
Well, he did. He provided a flower for her almost every day of their life. I don't know how he did it in the winter all the time, but he did, with a little short note about that he loved her. And he, as a matter of fact, when he was in the cabinet in Washington, D.C., they lived in the Shoreham Apartments next to the Shoreham Hotel. Right. And he'd go over to the Shoreham Hotel and grab a rose to put on her in the kitchen or wherever, so she could see it in the morning. And one day the manager of the hotel came out and said, Governor, I see you've been taking a rose from our garden every day and plucking it from the bushes. Here's a pair of scissors. It would be much less damaging if you'll use scissors.
Clean cut. Clean cut.
He continued to do it.
That's pretty good, and that was even later than we've been
that
talking
was later.
about. So.
My dad and mother did have a fabulous marriage, and it was quite something. He loved her enormously, and whenever that was her birthday or an anniversary or anything, he would get a bunch of dresses. He wouldn't buy them all. He'd get a bunch of them that she could try on, and then she could pick which one she wanted to keep. And I remember we'd all sit around and watch her twirl around the room in whatever dress that he brought, and then she'd be able to pick what she wanted.
Well, now, your mother probably had been active in a civic way in several capacities, but did she get into politics more heavily, you know, once your father was governor? Did that impel her to go around and, let's say, make speeches to Republican women's groups? I seem to remember a lot of that.
Well, she did. She in '62 when he ran. She went all over the state. She went to all the counties of the state. And my brother went with her, and they traveled everywhere. And she made speeches everywhere. She was a great speaker. She ended up helping him with his speeches. She'd had a background in theater, so she knew how to emphasize the things that were supposed to be emphasized in a talk. So she was very, very helpful to him that way, and she had her own ideas about what she thought was important and what she didn't think was important. She'd always been active in church affairs, and so one of the important aspects of my parents' lives was their activity in our church. In addition to being a governor and a great governor of this state, he was also a major leader of the Mormon church in this community, and was an early major leader, and my mother was very active in that. And then she was very active in a number of other charitable organizations, one of them being opera with Mrs. Henry Ford, and others being a number of other things.
Well, now...
And she became, when my brother was born, it was a traumatic event for her, and she was ill. She was never quite as well after that as she was before he was born. It took a lot out of her.
The last of 4 children, how old was she about when he was born?
I have to think about that, and that'll take too long for this taping.
Okay. Well, in any event, you were out at Stanford then for the 63-64 academic year.
She was in her late 30s.
She was in her late 30s, okay. Did you miss everything that was going on, do you feel, in your father's first term, or did you get reports? Were you following it? You'd come back on vacation. And, of course, the Cow Palace in San Francisco, you say you went to the convention. We'll get to that in a minute. But then you came back, and in the fall of '64, you started at Michigan State, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you were there at the tail end of his first term before his second term began. Do you remember anything about what was going on at that time?
Well, I do remember remember there was a lieutenant governor that was not a member of his party.
T. John
Lozinski. And so whenever my dad would leave the state, T. John would become the governor and try to undo everything that my dad would do. So my dad made a point of not leaving very much to afford T. John that opportunity. And he had to work with, did we have Bill, we had an auditor or treasurer, remember Billy Farnham?
Yes.
And my dad had to work with a number of other Democrats in the sort of the cabinet at the time.
Yeah.
And my dad told me the story once that most of the people that he met with, when he would meet with them privately, would come out and say something totally different than what occurred in their private meeting. And the one guy that would never do that, and that was totally honest, didn't agree with him politically.
Yeah.
What was totally honest was
Yep.
Billy Farnham.
Was
Billy
Billy
Farnham
Farnham.
was a totally honest
Very interesting.
politician.
Well, maybe that's the reason they named a building after him in
I'm
Lansing.
glad they
It's
did,
still
'cause
there.
he's a
Yeah.
quality guy.
Yeah. Well, T. John Lisinski also used to fire up cigars in the governor's limousine when George Romney was absent
Well,
from
in
the
his-
state.
yes,
and leave a lingering aroma that I'm sure your father did not appreciate.
Well, when he met with him, he would blow smoke in his face.
Oh, geez. Wow. Well, anyway, those were the days. Let me ask you this. I know early on, and this is something maybe you didn't know about that much, but I think there was some publicity. I think your father had the feeling that the Attorney General should kind of be the governor's legal advisor, legal counsel, and kind of do what the governor wanted him to do. And Frank Kelly said, no, I'm elected by the people. I'm independently accountable to the people. I don't follow your orders. You want to have a legal counsel, fine. They went through something for a while. Do you remember anything about that?
Not really very much. I do know that Frank Kelly took the position that he would be that he was the attorney for the governor, and also that he could take the position on the other side. So he preserved the right for the Attorney General to be on both sides of lots of issues, and that was a very fundamental thing that he did for many, many years.
Well, that probably didn't appeal to
I
your
don't
father
think that
very
appealed
much.
to very many people.
No.